Okay, fantastic. So it's another episode of our Future of the Built Environment series, and I've got a fantastic set of guests here today. I'll allow them to introduce themselves shortly. But the topic today is the retrofit gap, why the boring majority is the real battleground. So everyone's obsessed with those flagship buildings, the glossy retrofit, the big awards, the case studies, but they're the exception and not the solution. With over 77% of with over 70% of the 77% of the UK's commercial stock is underperforming, and that's where the real climate and financial wins are hiding. So today we're going to delve deep into that, and I'll allow as I say, the guests to introduce themselves shortly. But a quick intro from me. I'm Alex Whiffin. I'm the Managing Director of Cherry Pick People. That's a search and selection company that focuses on the real estate and prop tech sectors. I'm also the co-founder of a new talent consultancy called Redefine Futures. And at Redefine Futures, we focus specifically on helping our clients enhance their talent strategies to enable them to identify and acquire and retain, very importantly, the best people. I particularly love working with visionary leaders and innovative thinkers and helping them build their teams to help us reach net zero and a more sustainable world. So this topic is particularly a passion of mine. So before we get started, before I get you to introduce yourselves, I'd just like to say I want this discussion to be as interactive as possible. So if everyone out there has any questions at all, please put them in the chats, and I will field them to the panelists, as many as I can. And also, if anyone can say hi if you're watching and where you're watching from. I see Carly there has mentioned that she's watching from sunny Norfolk. So thanks, Carly. Taz as well said hi. So and I know there's a number of people have already sent me some questions in advance. So that's fantastic. So I hope everyone enjoys it, but by all means, get involved as much as possible. So without further ado, let's get started. Olga, do you want to start off giving us a quick introduction of you?
Sure, absolutely. Delighted to be here. Hello, everybody, and hi, Alex. Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm one of the co-founders of Building Atlas. Nick, my co-founder, is on the call as well. And we are building a tech platform, AI-enabled platform, to figure out how to retrofit commercial buildings at scale. I come from a very long career in the big tech, so now I'm bringing all the skills that I acquired there, all the knowledge of AI, to climate and the built environment.
Excellent, thanks, Olga. Julia, do you want to give us a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and hi everyone. Nice to see the messages coming in. I'm Julia Jones. I work for a company called MAP. We're a property management and sort of technical services company working within the UK. I lead on our Climate Ready service, which of course is quite topical. So it's all about kind of taking those high-level strategies, commitments, targets that corporates and companies have set, and really helping turn those into action. So what do the actual projects look like, and really focusing on that implementation. I've worked in this space for almost 10 years now. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Julia. Nick, you want to give us a quick rundown of your background?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again, Alex, for having us here. Looking forward to the discussion. I am Olga's co-founder. My background is in tech and consulting. Started out in investment banking technology through various flavors of consulting, and the past few years deep in sustainability.
Amazing. And finally, Matt, can you give us a rundown of your background and what you do?
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Really good to be here and looking forward to the conversation. So yeah, Matt Wilkinson. I'm a director at JLL, working within our EMEA-focused sustainability consulting team. And I lead on our ESG and climate strategy services. So part of that, which I suppose is most relevant to today, helping kind of largely large investors and global occupiers to develop their kind of decarbonisation and climate risk strategies. So looking right across their portfolios, what to focus on, what actions to take across kind of what timeframes, and really kind of how to derive the commercial benefits from that. So kind of how do we make this make sense to those organizations so that they can really drive those steps forward to kind of respond to this major need that we have.
Fantastic. Well, look, thanks everyone for the intro and being with us today. It's great to have you. And hi to Paul, who I see just messaged in there, and a few other people. So again, thanks for joining us. So let's kick this off. The first question is, what do we mean by the boring majority of buildings, and why have they been historically overlooked? Olga, do you want to kick this one off for us?
Yeah, I can start for sure. So when we talk about commercial real estate, most people immediately think about kind of flashy, big, well-known buildings. So the Shard, or the fancy buildings around Pancras Square in London. These are 1% of the 1%. So if you look at the stats that describe commercial buildings in the UK, actually only 1% are larger than 5,000 square meters. For comparison, the Shard is actually 127,000 square meters. So it's like beyond anything else that exists in the country. And 93% of the buildings are actually smaller than 1,000 square meters. So it's really, it's a house. It's not very different from, from many single-family homes. Most of the buildings are single unit. Very few of them are mixed use. And these buildings are just not exciting enough for consultants to go in there. There's not enough complexity, there's not enough need, and there's not enough value potentially to spend really expensive consulting hours to go and assess these buildings one by one. So obviously, the attention has always historically turned to much flashier buildings where the value corresponds with the cost of consulting.
Makes perfect sense. And so I suppose this might be a good one for you, Matt. I mean, why does focusing on the boring buildings represent not just a climate imperative, but a financial opportunity?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Alex. I think, as you say, we've really seen kind of the narrative around this evolve, I suppose, and really looking at kind of on two sides, really. I just think there's kind of one key driver is really that kind of avoidance of kind of brown discounts and that kind of financial risk, but also we're increasingly seeing kind of an opportunity come through. So I suppose to kick off on that financial risk perspective, kind of when we're thinking around kind of investors and the work that we do in that space, we're increasingly seeing CREM, so the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, which I'm sure most people are aware of, becoming kind of a real key decision point for a lot of investors. And where they're seeing those assets kind of either already stranding or kind of stranding within the next 10 years, are really kind of considering whether they want to move on those assets, and if they are, kind of potentially that having an impact on value as well. And again, we're seeing this kind of looking at kind of individual assets, but also kind of across portfolios as well, into which you will inevitably get more of those boring buildings coming through. I suppose just to bring a little bit of colour to that, on an annual basis at JLL, we do an investor survey. We go out to kind of all of the major global investors, and within that, we've managed to sneak in a few sustainability questions. And kind of the latest stats kind of from the 2025 report that's recently come out, saying that kind of those investors that were asked, 76% of them said that their decisions have actually been impacted by ESG. So whether that's kind of positively that they've decided to make a decision because of positive ESG, or they've actually stepped away or potentially kind of changed their approach to a decision because of ESG, they have been impacted. So we're seeing the vast majority are now considering this. And when we look at the topics that are driving that within commercial real estate, it's carbon. So again, you can see that this is really being considered by those investors. Therefore, there's kind of that potential risk on that side, as we are really seeing that kind of brown discount becoming more prevalent now really than those green premiums. The good news is we definitely are seeing an opportunity as well. So another piece that we've recently done, what we've been doing over the last couple of years, is looking essentially at the supply-demand imbalance. So as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, kind of a lot of occupiers, particularly kind of in office space and in those sorts of spaces, are kind of setting science-based targets, have their own net zero ambitions. And therefore, to achieve that, we'll need those low carbon office spaces and spaces to occupy. Which means that there's kind of a large demand for that space and a growing demand. But actually, when we've looked at it, the supply of those buildings that either kind of have that low carbon attributes or are going to come online by 2030, those low carbon attributes really don't stack up. So we're seeing kind of looking kind of globally across offices about a 70% unmet demand by 2030.
Right.
Which can, so kind of at a global level, really pretty pronounced. Kind of when we look at specific markets, London's that bit better calibrated with about with demand kind of outstripping supply of about 35%. But then you can really see how legislation can drive that as well, because occupiers need to meet that legislation too. So things like Local Law 97 in New York drives that imbalance around 65% and then sits around kind of 54% in Paris because of Decret Tertiaire. So what we really see there is then there's an opportunity that if those owners and those landlords and investors are to be able to turn around these boring buildings, they can play just as much a part in plugging that supply gap as anything else, and therefore can kind of not only potentially, depending on other market dynamics, achieve premiums in those lets, but certainly kind of secure those tenants early, reduce those void periods, so kind of overall has that commercial benefit for them. So we're really seeing that kind of, I suppose, that risk perspective being driven from fellow kind of other investors, but the occupiers creating a real opportunity there for those that can move forward kind of fast enough and at sufficient scale by looking at these boring buildings to really drive that opportunity.
Yeah, so there's that big sort of demand, supply and demand imbalance is the opportunity there, particularly when we're talking about the vast majority of buildings that aren't meeting those requirements. I mean, does anyone else want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point to raise. I think there's sort of two things that come to mind on that. I think one call out, and I would love if there's someone who is in the market who's on the webinar who can challenge me on this if they don't agree. But whilst we have this information, these statistics that show that the supply and demand, are in balance, that there is more demand than there is supply. What we're finding is sometimes when we are in that kind of business case stage with these projects, and sometimes they can be more or less expensive, that there's a perception that the increased value to the asset isn't reflected in the valuation exercise. So I know the kind of RICS valuation handbook has had updates around how you incorporate ESG, but it's not super straightforward. So there's a lot of obviously professional interpretation that goes into it. And the feedback we are getting from clients is, whilst we know that adding solar panels or an air source heat pump or whatever it might be is going to increase the value of my asset or is going to make it more desirable, this isn't actually being reflected in the numbers that I can get back from the professionals. So I think this is, I don't want to call it an artificial barrier because it's real, but it's something that we could address as an industry. So yeah, I think I said I had 2 points, but I'll leave it with that one. I think that one's something that's really struck me as something quite easy to fix, or we should be able to fix.
I think I might jump in there as well, Alex, and sort of agree and build on what Julia said. I think when we've done kind of analysis of price differentials across the country, and the advantage of having lots of data is being able to kind of prod and poke at those things. I think you see very different things, unsurprisingly, right? Again, if you look at a prime central London, you might see just very simply a value uplift from retrofitting a building. But if you go out to some sort of town somewhere, some retail park that's struggling anyway, perhaps to get tenants, and it's very much a buyer's market, what you don't see is a value uplift from the retrofit. But what you do see is where there are empty units, it's a buyer's market, and you're, all things being equal, going to pick the one that costs less to run. And you're not going to care whether it's retrofit or not. You're just going to care that it costs you less to heat it, especially on a margin where there's barely any, you're just scraping to make money at all. And so I think you might not see that in the stats, but what you can look for is, it's not quite brown discount, but it's kind of that, where you're just like, these units are just going to be void for a lot longer, as Matt kind of hinted at, where if you don't retrofit them, you're just kind of going to be a bit screwed.
Yeah. I think, sorry, Alex, just if I can really quickly build on that, I think, and back to Matt's point about that brown discount and the risk profile, I think there's been a perception, and probably there's still a a bit of that behavior. And as as sustainability consultants, we're wary of that, if you highlight, oh, a building is going to be stranded, let's say, or it's, you've got a few years and then actually, it's going to, let's say, drop in value, then there's a risk that, one of the decisions, rather than doing something to improve the building, the decision is, well, I'm going to remove this from my portfolio, right? So that my portfolio performance is better, but that asset hasn't been improved. But eventually, and especially, Olga's points about the percentages of buildings, we're not going to be able to just keep swapping them around between us. So eventually someone's going to need to improve the building, and it might as well be you, because if you do it now, it's going to cost you less and you're going to be able to benefit from those improvements for longer than if, you wait until everyone's forced to do it. Supply chain costs are going to go up, or, all the stuff that we know. So I think that's also one thing. Sometimes the analysis, it can make me a bit nervous, because you think, oh, does that just mean we're going to almost pass the buck to someone else? But actually, if we start looking at it as an opportunity, it says, no, I'm going to get in there before everyone else, because I'm going to benefit more.
It's a really interesting point, Julia. Actually, I don't see this passing the buck as something negative necessarily, because there are core funds that just buy and hold, and they just do not have the capacity or the funding structure to be able to do the retrofits. But there are more and more of these value-add funds that chase the opportunities in this space, and if they can retrofit these buildings efficiently, effectively, at scale, and then get paid very nicely for it, I think everybody wins.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what we're really starting to see in the market now as well, because again, kind of some of the research indicates that kind of those investors that are kind of chasing that kind of better performance is now kind of starting to kind of come across more of the market and more into kind of that private equity, and kind of, those kind of who are going to be flipping those assets kind of brown to green. I think we're really seeing that kind of as kind of those core investors are requiring kind of creme alignment and that better performance, then those kind of, I suppose, kind of smaller players and kind of more flexible players are then wanting to exit to them and are therefore needing to achieve those same targets. So I think, as you say, kind of it's not necessarily a major problem that kind of those core investors may be disposing of some of those assets, I suppose, in the hope, as you say, that they'll be then picked up by some of those investors with more capacity, really, to kind of make that improvement to get them back into the market. So I think we are starting to see the ecosystem kind of come together in that way. But then, back to Julia's initial point, it'll be interesting to see kind of the impact that the kind of the updates to the Red Book have in terms of kind of bursting that carbon bubble, as we almost see it, really. And kind of hopefully they start to be able to then reflect sustainability within those valuations. And then we'll start to hopefully start to see the market really start to move in the right direction.
Fantastic. I want to bring a question in from the audience now, actually, and this one came to us in advance. So Paul Seronio, I'm sorry if I said your name wrong there, but he got in touch in advance, actually, and put a few questions forward. And one I'd like to put to the panel is with the high IRRs cited at 46 to 92%, what are the barriers preventing institutional investors from flooding this space, and how can they be overcome? Who would like to take this one on?
I'd love to kick it off. So I really believe from having done a bunch of analysis across the whole country is that it's just a lack of knowledge. Right. So what we see in large portfolios, we're talking to a fund that may have about 1,000 buildings, and they pick maybe 1% of those buildings, so just a handful, 10, 15, and they do surveys, so physical surveys with somebody going into the building and counting the light bulbs and figuring out the age of equipment and so on, to understand what retrofit measures are possible. This doesn't scale. Right. So if you're looking for these opportunities across 1.7 million commercial assets, most of which are really nothing special and are probably very far away from where you are and the surveyor is, this just can't work. And that's why we need more solutions that can actually do this analysis as a desktop study, without having to send people to make a decision about each retrofit measure.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Olga. So And thanks everyone else for the comments and everything. So please keep the questions coming in. Next, I'd like to ask Julia, why has the built environment struggled to scale the retrofitting at pace, despite this climate urgency? What are your feelings around that?
Yeah, I think Olga's kind of touched on it. There's a knowledge piece, but I guess the way I think of it is almost in terms of resource scarcity, but in the sense of resource being like our time and attention spans, as well as money and funding is absolutely like a challenge that we can't ignore. Some of these interventions, I still kind of slightly maybe cringe when I have to make a recommendation around upgrade your lighting to LEDs, because it feels like so I guess a little bit obvious, but there's still loads of buildings that don't have LEDs everywhere. Or we replace every light bulb with an LED, and then suddenly we have super bright spaces, and we've actually got more lighting in than we need. So some of the interventions are really straightforward, but we have to remember that a lot of the decision makers or people involved aren't thinking about these things day in, day out, and so it isn't front and center of mind in the same way that it would be to those of us in this call. It's kind of that bias that we all have. So I think that's part of it. So absolutely agree with Olga on that, and the challenge of scaling, having very highly specialist experts going in. Some buildings will warrant that. But I do think the other one is a little bit this gap that we have between the sort of very high level country, Paris aligned targets, and then even corporate level, science-based. Matt, you talked about some of the work you've done with clients, and we do as well, where you'll have a corporate reduction target, but what does that mean for each of your assets? And I think that I've called it a policy gap. That's probably not quite right, but a strategy gap maybe. So it can be quite difficult to say, okay, I know what I need to do as a company. I maybe know what I need to do as a portfolio, but then breaking that down to each building and how that relates to action can absolutely be done. And I think Matt and his team does it. Our team does it. But like Olga said, it can be quite clunky. So being able to do that more speedily and more cheaply, I think is really important. Again, so the money can be spent on the interventions rather than on the assessments.
See, it's been a challenging market for the last few years, and and obviously, so costs are, the money isn't available as readily as it was. Do you think that means we need to have a bigger emphasis on the potential cost savings, operational cost savings of doing this, as opposed to, obviously, that we want to have a positive impact in the environment, but do you think the emphasis needs to be more on the opportunity to save rather than, or really emphasizing that to ensure that we pick up that pace?
Yeah, I suppose we've all spoken to it to a degree, but I think it's really bringing that commercial case to the fore, I think, at the moment. As you say, because in the hard times, people are going to be making much more strict decisions around that. But I think there's kind of two parts to that, I'd say. I think we talked around some of this in the build-up. I think obviously there are kind of some which will give you some measures which will give you kind of those neat paybacks kind of in a traditional ROI sense. But again, when we kind of look at kind of some of the, once you're going in kind of any kind of deeper need for retrofit or kind of anything further, it actually gets really hard to make that stack up on itself. So I think for that, then we're kind of needing to take kind of longer timeframes, that longer view across it, to really understand kind of the overarching kind of value of making this change. And whether that is around what we've talked around before, kind of, if you mean maintaining and securing tenants, or kind of that long-term maintenance of the asset's value, I think that's actually kind of where the story really sits to drive that change now, more than necessarily you put in X, Y, and Z, and it's going to then save you X amount on your energy bills, because I don't think that's going to drive us far enough and fast enough at the right rate. So I think we need that kind of wider reframing almost of kind of the value that this brings and the value it protects.
I think I might jump very briefly there, and I think it's interesting that sort of wider value piece. It's something we've been doing some work with a few different public sector organisations, and they think about very broad outcomes from this kind of thing, which is, if central government funds a programme to put solar panels on a bunch of schools, then the school is spending less on electricity, and they can spend that money on education, or on making the school more comfortable so it's not too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter, and you'd get more productive children who are better educated, and that's the outcome of your retrofit, right? And I think if we think about the programs as that broad, even if that comes to making more efficiently run retail spaces or offices or whatever else it might be, I think that's really important to think about. And it comes again as you do those things programmatically, that yes, every building is a snowflake and they're all used differently, but at the same time, doing a bunch of these interventions, and as Julia mentions, even things that feel obvious, like LED lighting, that perhaps no one's just paid attention to, and just saying, we're going to run a program, we're going to go and do that to all 1,000 of your buildings because it just needs to be done, it makes such a difference.
Yeah, and I think just to build on both those points, but I think, Matt, I think it is really important to call out the fact that certain retrofit measures do not have a straightforward return on investment that is nice and neat of like, it's going to cost you this much upfront, but you will save an equivalent amount or more year on year in your operational costs. They don't all have that. That doesn't mean they don't have a return on investment, like Nick was saying, that in a more holistic view. But automatically what you've done, going back to that resource piece, what you've done is introduce complexity. You've introduced, you're going to have to use new language or maybe more creative thinking about how you present that to your stakeholders, to your board for sign off, because it's not a neat formula of like X plus Y equals Z. I just think I'm glad we've called it out, because I think otherwise we can, be lost in terms of trying to go down a route, and then we're going to find, oh gosh, it doesn't stack up. What now? But if we know that from the beginning, I think going back to that stakeholder piece and understanding, okay, why do you want to improve your buildings? Why do we want to make these interventions? We're improving them. We're making them more fit for purpose for now, but also for the future. Are we going to be improving the local community because, this retail park, which has a few units, that void space, we're actually going to, rent it to a local charity at a discounted rate, whatever it might be. But I think it's, if we know what those other drivers that are about growth and kind of positive incentives, rather than just presenting it as, oh, this is a cost. Is it a cost that you're willing to pay? That feels like very different to say, is this an investment you're willing to make to improve something? And I guess the what of your improving will just depend on the client and the organization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think just to kind of add one case study, I guess, against that, because I think sometimes feels quite hard to do this, particularly in kind of very commercial spaces. So interestingly, kind of over the last few years, been working with a big global bank, spent quite a lot of time looking at their offices and kind of decarbonizing those spaces, which was that bit more straightforward. Then opened up the tricky box of all the retail estate, which was kind of a really complex piece, kind of on many levels. One, kind of what you can actually do, because they very much fall into this boring building box. When you're then looking at the owners, you're kind of looking at then engaging with kind of mom and pop landlords who kind of maybe don't have kind of the knowledge or the capacity to turn this around. And then the costs are quite high, and again, quite a lot of the ROIs weren't there. So again, there is then unlocking it and actually understanding kind of the drivers from their side are really about creating the right spaces for employees and then the bank users. And again, then being able to kind of pull this together, kind of similar to what you were saying, Nick, in terms of, okay, well, the quality of those spaces, how comfortable are they to be in? How is this kind of representing what the bank is doing for the environment and with kind of those people's money, essentially? That was then a real unlock to be able to then open up kind of that wider view of value and then start driving change within that kind of tricky retail estate, which again, I think speaks directly to that kind of boring buildings when you look at some of these spaces. So yeah, I think my mind often thinks it's really tough to do that within very commercial spaces, but that was kind of a nice, heartening case study where I actually managed to kind of drive that forward.
I really think about this in terms of just future-proofing the assets. And we obviously talked about tenants choosing the assets that are better. We talked a little bit about the regulation, but misregulation is ultimately relatively short-term. What is also happening is that banks will simply refuse to finance unretrofitted assets. That's already happening with kind of the high street banks. But also we need to be thinking about the climate resilience, right? Heat waves are everywhere, flooding is everywhere. And what people forget is that the interventions that they're putting in today might actually be the last interventions that they're going to put in before 2040 or 2050. So if you're doing a change to your building today and you're replacing an old gas boiler with a new gas boiler, you're just locking in the carbon and you're locking in the fact that your building is going to be overheated in 15 years. If it's an office building that's overheated for much of the summer, it's not an office building anymore, it's a stranded asset. So there's that value also that you're just protecting, and it is quite significant.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I mean, I'd like to just bring in, there's been a good conversation going back and forth in the comments, actually. I'm interested to get some of the panel's thoughts on this. It was Nick Petrie was talking about the BMS systems and the fact that they can save up to 50% off HVAC energy consumption. He said these are critical systems that should be at the forefront of any building energy reduction plans. And then I think I saw Farry bouncing back, challenging him on what those should be and how much they're used. What do the panelists feel about the sort of impact or the usage or the need of an up-to-date and sophisticated BMS system to manage the energy consumption?
I wouldn't mind jumping in there, but I'm sure the others have thoughts too. I think, at least as we look at the vast majority of buildings across the country, they don't have a BMS, or they don't have any sense of modern BMS. You might have some vague sense of control system for the HVAC, but they're typically outdated. I hear lots of stories of, if you try and go and get data from them, they maybe at best hold a month's worth of data. So you actually can't do historic analysis of how well the building's performing. Any building that's been built in the last 10 or 20 years probably has systems for heating and cooling, but they don't talk to each other. So we see many, many, many cases where buildings are both heated and cooled at the same time. Or worse, they're heated and cooled and then somebody opens the window. And so it's a lovely idea, but I think we actually see, ironically, it's kind of really cheap modern tech of kind of IoT sensors and clamps and things of just getting the data to know what's going on in the buildings. I think the other point is BMSs or at least control systems, I definitely agree, are important. We've been looking at, for example, using telemetry like mobile phone data to know if a building's occupied or not. So you can combine that with meter data to say, hey, this building is clearly being heated, or all the lights are on at 4 a.m. and everyone left at 6 p.m. And those are obvious. I think that the flip of that is something both Matt and Julia have mentioned, which is tenant engagement, is you can automate those things too far that people just resent the systems and turn them off. So actually you need to find that balance in the engagement that says we can drive efficiency without making sure that, we turn off the heating at 5 p.m, but actually most people work late and so they need it on, or vice versa. So I think yes to all the above, but I think most buildings, at least in that majority of, as we've been calling boring buildings, most of them don't have those systems today.
This might lead us on quite nicely to what are some of the most promising low-cost, high-impact retrofit interventions you've seen that deliver measurable ROI?
I think for these boring ones, honestly, like some of the stuff that Julia and Matt have already mentioned. So first of all, just tenant engagement around behavior change, right? If you're a retail unit, just close the damn door. Nobody really cares whether it's open or not. We heard a story about schools just last week, talking to one of our potential customers, and the building manager doesn't work on Fridays, so the heating stays on for the whole weekend, right? So that's 30% of energy use right there that you can cut off. But then, of course, things like LEDs. Yes, if the building is not professionally managed, most likely it doesn't actually have LED lights. Optimization, BMS. So I actually disagree with Nick a little bit here. I think BMS is amazing, but BMS really, from the ROI perspective, works better for larger buildings, but much simpler control systems. So an app and a couple sensors here and there. That could be quite a bit more cost effective, could be installed in smaller buildings. Things like thermostatic radiator bulbs, right? So a lot of stuff around the control before you really start digging into the fabric of the building or swapping out the heating systems. Because what you need to do in any case before doing these massive interventions is bring down the heating and cooling load as much as you can. So you can size the equipment correctly when the time actually comes to do those major retrofit interventions.
Yeah, I think just to add on that and kind of maybe bringing in the BMS and sort of smart element in there, I think a lot of the times what we see is there'll be like a huge drop in year one, and that's still great, but you don't necessarily keep seeing it. But I guess, again, rather than saying that means it's not worth it, it's like, no, let's do that and then move into like the interventions. Just one on lighting. I was walking around a building yesterday, and it's the LEDs, and then we have those the sensors, the PIR. So I walk in and the lights come on, and that's great. But if you have like a reception space or spaces where you might have people coming in all the time, on a nice sunny day like it was for most of yesterday, they were all on, and there was absolutely no need for there to be lights on in that space. So like, kind of sensors and things so that light switches don't get sort of left on, great. But if they haven't been combined with maybe a lux sensor, something like that, then actually you're having lights on longer than you need to. So things that help bring down those loads that are maybe that they are really cheap and cheerful and easy to install, like sensors and kind of Internet of Things, like Nick alluded to, that actually in the right context could make a really big difference. So at least get that baseline to a more true baseline, because then you know what you're working to for your more expensive retrofit measures.
Excellent. I've got I don't know, a question in here from Farry, who's saying, are there an AI that can help? Is there an AI that can help retrofit with the impacts of OPEX for not just a building but a portfolio? Asking if this could help large investment funds make decisions backed with multiple scenarios.
Is this a plug, Olga, Nick? Did you?
I promise this wasn't a plug. Shall I? I'll
go
jump
for
in.
it.
I mean, yes, in short summary, that's exactly what Building Atlas is, and what we're building is a platform to model the best retrofit interventions across portfolios. So no matter the size of the portfolio, using data and AI to model what the best interventions are for the least cost, that maximize OPEX savings, carbon savings, energy savings across portfolio.
Fantastic. I think you couldn't have asked a better question, Farry, so thanks for that one. Next question is, many boring buildings are occupied, aging, or technically complex. What retrofit approaches are work best under these types of constraints? Julia, do you want to take this one on?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on some of it, but I think sometimes there's maybe a perception, back to Olga's point, there's a perception of technical complexity, and actually they are much simpler than the big flagship projects that we've already proven, or we've already done these sorts of projects on, but maybe because they are less exciting, or they're or you do have occupiers that can't move out, that does bring a level of consideration. But we've been as MAP, effectively any projects we would do will have tenants in occupation, and really we're not going to be able to move people out for these works. So what we recently had a project, we were really pleasantly surprised, when we drafted our program and our budget, we'd established that works would have to be undertaken out of hours at nighttime over like weeks, because we're just like, they'll have to do a little bit of work, then come back, so on and so forth, to mitigate that impact. When we went out to market, we actually found a contractor that was able to do the whole lot. So swap out the gas boiler for the new air source heat pump and upgrade the air handling unit over a weekend. Wow. So this was an office space, but not a sort of big and glamorous one. And that was amazing. That completely changed the game. It completely changed the the perception of the project and the cost. Of course, the cost of the kit was the same, but the overheads and stuff of having people on site were reduced. So again, it's it's bringing in the people with the expertise and the knowledge that actually can do things in more novel ways. And now that we've done that once, that same client is so much more comfortable. We're doing it on another building, and then hopefully we'll do it on another and another. So you can start to see how you can pick up speed. But again, with occupation, with buildings and occupation, it's really about that planning phase. So it's that stakeholder engagement, it's that communication, it's that preparation. So, get absolutely everything ready so that when you're swapping out systems, it is almost, and I know there'll be engineers that hate me for this, but it's sort of almost as simple as unplug one system and plug the other one in type thing. Yeah.
Excellent. Sort of moving on, what do you think are the biggest risks of retrofit paralysis? Is it decision fatigue, procurement, or something else? Matt, do you want to take this one on?
Yeah, I suppose for me, one of the kind of there's a couple of probably two things I think of really when it comes to kind of, I suppose, what's kind of driving that retrofit paralysis almost really. I think one of those is kind of not really kind of when I'm thinking around kind of boring buildings, kind of thinking of that kind of sitting within kind of a large portfolio. So there we've got kind of 100, 1,000, 3,000 assets. I think there's kind of a real paralysis that comes from not knowing kind of where to focus and what to do. So I think it's kind of having that initial assessment to say, okay, across these assets, where is actually the greatest capacity to have that impact? So you can see kind of which of those kind of most material assets, but then having that second view then across that to see, okay, then, and across these assets, where is an approach that we can then deliver at scale? I think it kind of comes back to some of what Olga was saying before in terms of, okay, then, well, can we just run kind of a fairly simple approach of across all these assets, we need to get the lighting upgrades to a certain level, and we need to kind of get the building kind of systems running to a certain degree? Or is there actually kind of a major scheme that can be done in looking at kind of electrification of heat across all these assets as well? And I think kind of once you know kind of which assets to focus and what to be doing against them, you've kind of unlocked one part. And then I think the other kind of surprisingly tricky piece that we've come across when we're looking at some of these large portfolios is actually then having the right people in place to deliver these programs. Because I think what we often end up having is you've got your kind of sustainability team and your kind of portfolio-wide management teams who kind of understand kind of what needs to be done. You've then got your asset managers who have already got full-time jobs that don't necessarily involve all of these things that are sitting on the side of their desk. And you need that kind of middle person to sit there who's got kind of significant project management experience and skill, but has also got that kind of technical engineering knowledge and insight to be able to kind of really dig down and actually deliver the details of this. And actually, when you look across the board, those skill sets coming together is relatively unique. And again, kind of finding that person being able to drive that in a way that delivers these projects and actually creates probably quite a cultural shift to be able to deliver these projects across all those different assets can actually be really complex. I think to a degree, recognizing that issue is kind of one big part of that. And then finding that person, again, whether that's an in-house person or kind of bringing in someone from a third party to be able to support with that while gaining that support from the bottom up, I think is a real kind of piece, which is kind of delaying this actually kind of coming through. I think where we've seen it work really well, they're kind of some major investors where they've kind of really got that vertically integrated approach. And they really have kind of that sustainability thread running through, and they've got different sustainability professionals kind of in different levels of the business to really help guide these sorts of large programs. But I think without that kind of coordinator or those aligned coordinators, it's actually really difficult to deliver this in a unified way.
It's a big challenge with the...
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit to what Matt is saying. I mean, there's obviously, if you lack knowledge, there is a risk of paralysis where you're basically just sitting there staring at your portfolio and not doing anything. And that is bad. We talked about strengths, and that is like capital V bad. But I also think that doing the wrong thing to the building is actually worse. And we see a little bit of that where, people will send surveyors into a couple of their buildings and they come back with reports and they say, okay, first you do optimization and heat pump, and then you do the fabric upgrades. And they say, okay, we're going to use that as a blueprint for all our buildings. And these buildings are boring and they're not special, but they're not all the same. And there's a real cost, opportunity cost, to actually doing the wrong thing to the wrong building. You go in and you rip out the gas boiler and you put in the heat pump, and it turns out that your EPC actually used to be C and it became D for some unknown to you reason, and you're out of capex. So you don't actually have money anymore. So you made your asset worse. You didn't really de-risk it, and you just don't have the opportunity to do the right thing anymore. And that's why I really think that you do need to be looking across the whole portfolio, right? Like finding those right opportunities, the needle in the haystack, or the low-hanging fruit, whatever you want to call it, and having a very principled approach to creating those retrofit programs that are not building by building, but that start from the bottom up, from the top down, and then focus on specific buildings that have been identified as opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where that strategic approach really comes in, as you say, kind of within that, really considering the building characteristics when you're then kind of extrapolating some of those learnings to make sure, as you say, that, yeah, those interventions you're recommending make the most sense. So I think it requires that kind of top down, but also that bottom up feed in as well, because there's nothing more frustrating to those asset managers of being told, yeah, you need to go and roll out lighting upgrade across these assets. Like, we already have full LED throughout this asset. So I think, as you say, it's having that kind of strategic view, but making sure you've got that feed in from an asset level so that you understand kind of the characteristics of those assets in their current position. So you can then advise on, yeah, what the best interventions are at scale.
Having that coordinator in place, as you mentioned before, Matt, to sort of manage all of that and understand or bring that all together is obviously vital, because it's a challenging projects that we're talking about. Cool. So how do you, my next question is, how should policymakers, how do you think policymakers should design incentives to accelerate retrofits on the long tail of buildings and not just the glossy few? Who would like to take this one on?
So I'll have a crack, but I definitely am interested in Matt, well, everyone's views, I would say. This is a really interesting one for me, particularly. I think moving my experience in the past prior to joining MAP was more on the construction and built environment, and now moving into, I guess, property and day-to-day running. And I do think one of the reasons that we have this decision paralysis, or we focus on the shiny versus the boring majority, is how separate our industry is in terms of people operating the buildings and the people designing them and doing the big projects. So I think there is also just something, I think that's why it's nice having, teams and people, I guess, like Matt and JLL, and then like myself at MAP, where, we are sitting in both spaces a little bit, because that feedback loop doesn't happen enough. I don't know if that's the space for policymakers, but it was just something that, came to mind. I think it's been interesting seeing, we really have seen EPCs and the minimum energy standard requirements, like the MEES regulations, drive awareness and actions from our clients. So it's been very successful in that sense. And the same with Part L, obviously having a minimum performance of your buildings, that if you're designing a new building or doing a big project, you have to meet. The problem we have is, I think, that they've not kept up with the pace of change, or the learning and understanding of how buildings actually need to be performing now. So I know there's been consultation out, and I think kind of updates to those building standards and building regs that just really clearly kind of says that's what you need to meet for your building. That would be step one. I know there's nervousness when you set exact targets, because lots of buildings are different, but I do think, we've kind of done that in the past, and that was a great first step, but we need to, and it has made a difference, but they're just not quite fit for purpose anymore. They just haven't kept up with where buildings need to be. So updating EPCs and Part L, I guess, is one of the answers, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think kind of when Part L was last updated, kind of there were a lot that didn't feel it kind of went far enough. So I think kind of driving that further forward on kind of a further update. And I think, yeah, I agree with the point on kind of MEES, and I think it's an interesting piece. I think it has the kind of minimum energy efficiency standards have driven a level of change. But I think it's always interesting to see kind of how delayed the actual real change is. And I think we see it kind of with MEES. You can see it if you look across the pond at the States with Local Law 97, that so many people saw this coming, but really weren't acting. And now it's kind of they're now acting, or unfortunately in some cases deciding that actually it's more cost effective to just not comply, but that's a different part. So I think within it, there's kind of a piece of kind of needing to kind of speed up that ratcheting approach that we're seeing kind of within MEES. I mean, obviously there's consultations ongoing at the moment, but I think kind of let's use our EPCs perfect? No, but what we've got at the moment, yes. Are they something people can speak to? Yes. Does it drive some change? Yes. I think we just need to kind of stick with that and kind of drive that forward, while probably looking across to Europe to see what's happening with EPBD as well, and kind of really understanding, okay, how is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive kind of starting to kind of better align and harmonize those certificates, and again, kind of set those minimum energy performance standards. So I think there's kind of an opportunity to look at how others are doing this, bring that here in the UK, and kind of drive further ambition behind it to really start to make that change.
Excellent. And I read in your report, Olga and Nick, at the end of 2024, I think it was 22.2% of the buildings were not meeting the future energy efficiency standards. So that that's a big majority. So there's a big percentage of, or only 22% were meeting it. Sorry,
22% are meeting. Yeah. So the strain and risk is really quite immense. It's about 3/4 of the buildings. Yeah.
Huge. And there is legislation to stop buildings being tenanted. So if they're not meeting certain standards, that goes up over time, right? So are we seeing these? Are we coming close to the cliff edge, if you see what I mean? Are we going to have a lot of stranded assets?
It's a really interesting question. So if you look at the regulation historically, at some point back in mid-teens, it became impossible to lease F and G buildings. And if you look at the building portfolios right now, there are no Fs and Gs, right? There are some stray Es, maybe, which are also quite bad, but most of the buildings are actually D, C, B, and A. The MEES regulation hasn't landed, so it's still it's been in consultation for the last couple of years. And I think there might be a bit of a split in the industry where some people basically think that it's just never going to happen, or it's going to be delayed, diluted, and they're taking a very significant risk. While others are basically saying, yeah, that's fine, even if it's delayed, and even if my buildings don't need to be B by 2030, and it's going to be 2031 or 2032, the massive run on the retrofit supply chain, on the labor to install these measures is going to be completely unmanageable, right? So the kind of the smart investors are taking care of their buildings now while they still can, to do it cost effectively, while the installers pick up their phones.
Yeah.
So
we're going to have a retrofit crunch.
The risk is there. We're not retrofitting nearly fast enough. It needs to be about 4% of the building stock a year. It's more like 1%. It's the Gordian knot of not knowing where to start, not knowing how to finance it, not knowing who is actually going to do this. And absolutely love the work that Matt and Julia are doing, but this consulting approach becomes a bottleneck because there are just not enough Matts and Julias to look at all these buildings.
Yeah, I think there's a great example of that in the UK right after Grenfell. And it's not just about how many people can go and install better cladding or the manufacturers of the cladding, but it's fire safety assessors, building surveyors. There's, obviously still the vast majority of buildings with cladding waiting to have that fixed. And the same will happen potentially with retrofit. Even if the dates slip for MEES, it's going to be that chaos again. And I think, both planning ahead and finding efficient ways of delivering programs of work, and even efficient ways of assessing the buildings, ahead of time is the only way to get ahead of that. Otherwise, people are just going to be stuck.
Fair enough. Well, do you think we should be rethinking the asset valuation models to reward carbon performance more directly? Who wants to take that one?
I do see there's a significant risk at the moment. I kind of spoke to it a little bit before, the kind of what we see as the carbon bubble, essentially. That obviously kind of from a valuer's perspective, they can only reflect the market, they can't move the market. But at the moment, none of the kind of, it's rare that the ESG kind of information or kind of carbon related information is being kind of captured when decisions are being made, which means that there's nothing they can then reflect within their valuation, and kind of then lenders can't capture that, and it keeps the cycle perpetuating. And then we're not calculating in the carbon risk of these assets. I think Julia alluded to it earlier, kind of there have been some updates to the Global Red Book and kind of RICS recently that kind of require that ESG data has to be considered and needs to be referred to, even if it's to say it didn't impact the value. But I think there definitely needs to be, on my view, personal view would be, there needs to be kind of more of a drive toward integrating sustainability, both from a kind of transition risk, so the decarbonisation, and absolutely in terms of the physical risk, in terms of the changing climate within assets, because otherwise we are just creating this bubble, which at some point will inevitably burst and poses a significant risk to the whole real estate sector and the values that we're seeing against assets.
Yeah, and I think just to that point, I guess going back to a point around, you know, flagship special projects versus you know, the majority. I think that part of why we have that challenge with the valuation, that feedback loop, Matt, that you just took us through, is because oftentimes these buildings where we have done the proof of concept in terms of the technologies and stuff, which can be replicated elsewhere, maybe not everything, but a lot of the stuff, you know, could be used in the boring majority. The problem is, if we're trying to unpick, you know, how much extra or what that was, you know, per square foot, it becomes really hard, because actually those were the flagship projects to begin with. So they're going to have the premium finishes, they're going to have the, you know, the premium consultants, the like all that kind of stuff. And I did a lot of work in, you know, in a past life, particularly talking to those cost managers, cost consultants teams, because we get those questions from clients, you know, give me a pound per square foot or a pence per square, you know, whatever it might be. And you can get it for certain elements, but, you know, I think, again, for valuation professionals to try to unpick exactly how much a solar panel, air source heat pump, double glazing, whatever it is, LED lighting, it becomes quite tricky, because it's often blended with the fact that, oh, well, this was a flagship project and it was premium anyway. And then, so sometimes what you do to get is say, oh, sustainability increased the project cost by 10%. It's like, well, no, it didn't. The project was 10% more because it was a premium project.
Fair enough. So we're coming to the end now. I just want to wrap up with one final question to each of you. So we've only got a couple of minutes, so keep it brief. But what one action would you urge the real estate sector to take this year to close the retrofit gap, especially for the boring but essential buildings?
My answer is going to be simple. What I've been saying this whole webinar: don't wait and look across your whole portfolio.
Julia?
I'm going to take the opposite approach, but do one project on one boring building, because you'll learn so much from it, and you'll have ripped the band-aid of like that unknown that's really uncomfortable when you've never done it before. And then, you know, you've done your one, and then you can look at your whole portfolio.
Scale, exactly. Nick?
I think it's probably a combination of those. Back from my tech background, whenever we were doing new and novel things, we always used to talk about prove and scale. And it is literally the combination of those two things. Go do a thing and then go and do it 1,000 times. And I think that's kind of where we're at, that people in the retrofit world in general are doing a thing, right? That's your showcase headquarters building with a green roof and it's BREEAM outstanding. Like, that's lovely, but you need to replicate all the things you learned programmatically rather than just keep thinking of each one by one.
Perfect. And finally, Matt?
Yeah, I suppose a similar piece, but maybe flipped in terms of, work out what it is that needs to be done, and then go and do that on that asset to prove it refeed it into your model, and then take it across the portfolio.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, look, thanks so much for joining me, everyone. It's been a fantastic discussion. The comments in the comment section were really going crazy, and I couldn't keep up with them all. So sorry if I didn't manage to ask your question to the panel, but thanks for everyone for watching and being a part of it and joining in. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone.